The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly beneath a pale autumn sky. The land painted in gold and gray where the tall grass swayed against the cold wind out there. Far from town and far from the reach of most men lived Eli Turner, a rancher known more by rumor than by face to the townsfolk. He was a quiet shadow who rode in only when necessity forced him to buy feed. To trade leather or to collect mail he rarely opened, they called him the Silent Rancher. And for good reason. Eli hadn't always been this way years ago, before war, before loss. He'd been a man of laughter and music. His wife, Martha, used to say his voice could calm even a spooked horse. But that was before the fever took her and their unborn child. Since that day, Eli's voice had fallen silent. His ranch became his refuge and his prison, acres of fenced solitude, where he buried himself in endless work and silence thick enough to drown. And each morning began the same: the creak of the barn door, the low snort of horses, and the cold breath of dawn against his neck. He spoke only to the animals. Never expecting an answer, the world had turned small and predictable, a rhythm of chores, meals and memories best forgotten when Eli rode into Hollow Creek. It was out of necessity, not desire. The town was lively in its modest way. Children chasing each other through the muddy streets, women haggling over prices at the general store, men sharing stories on wooden porches. Eli kept his hat low. His words few. He was there to trade for grain, nails, and a new rope, nothing more. But fate has a way of finding even those who wish to be left alone. As Eli tied his horse outside the general store, a small voice caught his ear, faint, like a breeze but clear enough to make him pause. "Mama, I'm hungry." He turned slightly, and that's when he saw them, a young woman and a little girl. Standing beside the store window, the woman's dress was patched, her shawl thin against the chill. Her face was pale, drawn tight by fatigue, but her eyes held quiet determination. The girl, no older than 6, clutched a worn rag doll, her cheeks streaked with dirt and innocence. Eli looked away, telling himself it wasn't his concern. There were always those who struggled. The prairie was unforgiving to the weak. But as he stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, he couldn't shake the image of those eyes, the kind that had seen too much hunger and too little kindness inside. The storekeeper was chatting with a few townsfolk about the coming winter. "It'll be a hard one," he said, "and harder still for folks without steady work." Eli caught fragments. A widow trying to make ends meet, sewing for pennies. Her husband lost in a mine collapse. He didn't need to ask who they were talking about when he stepped back outside. The little girl was still there, trying to brush dust from her mother's skirt, her gaze lifted. Meeting Eli's for a moment, it wasn't the look of a beggar or a child asking for pity. It was something quieter, a fragile curiosity. As if she could sense there was something good still buried deep within him, Eli tipped his hat and walked past. He didn't speak, he didn't linger, but as he mounted his horse and turned toward home, he felt the weight of that look settle inside him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. And a question he wasn't ready to answer. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment's distraction, but the truth, which he refused to admit even to himself, was that the Silent Rancher's heart had stirred for the first time in a long while. And far behind him, in the dusty street, the little girl watched him ride away, not knowing that the quiet man she'd seen that day would soon change her life, and her mother's forever. The small cabin at the edge of Hollow Creek had once been cheerful before the accident. Clara Dawson used to fill it with laughter and the smell of warm bread. Her husband, Thomas, worked in the nearby silver mine, and though their life was simple, it was enough. But when the mine collapsed one cruel spring afternoon, Clara's world caved into. The pay stopped. The neighbors offered sympathy but not help, and soon only Clara and her little girl, Annie, were left, two souls clinging to each other against the growing cold of life without hope by the time autumn came. The money was gone Clara took in sewing, mending shirts for the miners and stitching dresses for the merchants' wives. But the work was scarce and the pay barely enough to buy bread. Annie often went to bed hungry. Her tiny hands clutching the rag doll Thomas had made her from an old handkerchief still. She never complained. "Mama," she'd whisper as Clara tucked her in. "God's just waiting for the right day to send us something good." Clara would smile and stroke her daughter's hair. Though her heart broke a little more each time, she had stopped believing in something good long ago. It was on one of those cold afternoons, gray clouds hanging low over Hollow Creek, that Clara decided to try her luck in town. Her fingers were bleeding from needlework, her head light from hunger. But she couldn't let Annie starve. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, took Annie's small hand, and walked the dusty mile to Main Street. The town was busy, full of chatter and bustle, people preparing for the harsh winter ahead. Clara moved among them like a ghost. Some nodded politely. Others pretended not to see her. She went to the baker's shop, the smell of fresh bread filling her senses until her stomach ached. Just one loaf. She thought, one loaf to last a day or two, but she had only a few coins left. Not enough. "Please, sir," she whispered to the baker, her voice trembling, "could I buy half?" The baker looked at her, then at the little girl by her side. His eyes softened for a moment, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry. Ma'am, can't cut the loaves. You'll have to come back when you've got more." Clara nodded, shame and despair washing over her. She turned to leave. And that's when she noticed the man outside, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a weathered hat. He was tying a rope to his saddle, his expression hard and distant. There was something about him, the quiet strength, the stillness that made her pause. Annie tugged at her skirt. "Mama, who's that man?" Clara shook her head. "Just a rancher's sweetheart, let's go." But as they walked past, Annie couldn't help but glance back. The rancher, Eli Turner, though they didn't yet know his name, looked up briefly. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Clara saw sorrow there, deep and wordless, like a man who'd buried too many dreams, and in that moment, she felt something stir inside her. Not hope, exactly, but recognition. Later that day, when a light drizzle began to fall, Eli offered them a ride to the edge of town. Clara hesitated, wary of a stranger's kindness. But the thought of Annie walking in the cold made her accept. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves muffled by the wet earth. Annie, perched between them, talked softly about birds and stars, filling the emptiness with innocent warmth. Eli didn't say much, just nodded, listening to her chatter like a man hearing music for the first time in years. Clara noticed the way he held the reins, careful, deliberate, as if afraid to break something fragile. When they reached the cabin, Clara thanked him quietly. "We'll be all right," she said. Though her voice trembled, Eli only tipped his hat and rode away into the mist, but Annie watched him go, eyes bright with childish certainty. "Mama," she whispered, "I think that man's going to help us someday." Clara smiled sadly, brushing snowflakes from her daughter's hair. "Maybe. Sweetheart, maybe." Neither of them knew then that Annie's innocent words would soon become a prophecy, one that would melt even the hardest of hearts. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, Hollow Creek lay under a thin blanket of snow, the sky a dull white that promised more to come. The wind howled down the narrow streets, driving people indoors and hunger deeper into the bones of those with little to eat. For Clara Dawson and her daughter Annie, each day became a test of endurance. One more night to survive, one more meal to pray for. The small woodpile behind their cabin was nearly gone. Clara rationed what she had, burning one log at a time and cooking thin soup that barely filled a cup. Her fingers were raw from sewing, her eyesight strained from working late by candlelight. She told Annie stories to keep her distracted, tales of angels watching over them, of spring flowers waiting beneath the snow, but when her daughter fell asleep, Clara would sit by the window and cry quietly. Her tears freezing before they hit the sill. Annie noticed the change in her mother, the tiredness in her voice and the way she coughed more each day. Children are observant in ways adults often forget. She began to worry, not for herself, but for her mama, and somewhere inside her small heart, a seed of determination began to grow one morning. After a long night of coughing, Clara could barely stand. She told Annie she would be fine, that she just needed rest, but Annie knew better. When Clara fell asleep, the little girl wrapped herself in her mother's shawl and stepped out into the cold. The snow bit at her cheeks, but she kept walking toward town, toward the only person she thought might help. She didn't know his name, only that he had eyes that looked both sad and kind. The man who had given them a ride weeks before, the man she had whispered about every night since. When Eli Turner rode into Hollow Creek that day to trade for salt and flour, he didn't expect anyone to speak to him, least of all a small girl waiting by the general store. But there she was, standing in the snow, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her shawl. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide with fear and determination. He dismounted slowly. "You shouldn't be out here, kid," he said gruffly. Though there was no anger in his tone, Annie looked up at him, her small voice breaking as she spoke the words that would change both their lives. "Mister, please marry my mama. She's all I have now." Eli froze for a long moment. All he could hear was the wind and the pounding of his own heart. He knelt down, his gloved hand brushing snow from her shoulder. "What did you say?" Annie's eyes filled with tears. "Mama's sick. We don't got no food left. I tried to help her, but I can't. She needs someone strong, like you." Her innocence struck him harder than any bullet could. Eli had faced battlefields, death, loneliness, but this tiny voice asking for salvation, it undid him completely. He saw Martha's face in the child's eyes, heard echoes of promises he'd never kept. For a long while, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, this fragile little soul standing against the winter wind. Then, finally, his voice came, low and steady. "Go on home. Little one, I'll come by soon." Annie nodded, trusting him completely. She smiled faintly before turning to walk back down the road. Eli watched her go, the weight of her words pressing deep into his chest. "Please marry my mama." It wasn't about marriage. He knew it was about saving someone. It was about faith, the kind he'd long forgotten how to have. He stood there for a long time after she disappeared from sight, the snow falling quietly around him. Then, without another thought, he turned his horse toward the valley road. Somewhere out there was a dying woman and a child who still believed in miracles, and for the first time in years, Eli Turner decided to believe too. Eli Turner had known hunger, grief, and the kind of silence that comes after burying the people you love, but he had never known a silence as heavy as the one that followed. Annie's plea. Those words echoed in his mind on the long ride home, slicing through the wind and the creak of his saddle. "Please marry my mama. She's all I have now." He tried to brush it off, to tell himself it wasn't his concern. The prairie was full of widows and orphans, and a man couldn't save them all. He had his ranch to tend, fences to mend, cattle to feed. But as the days passed, he found himself staring too long at the horizon, wondering if the little cabin by Hollow Creek still had smoke rising from its chimney at night. He sat by his fire, staring at the flames until they blurred. The warmth felt hollow. Every creak of the wind outside sounded like a whisper, a child's voice calling for help. He poured himself a cup of coffee, though he didn't drink it, and whispered into the empty room, "You can't fix the world, Eli." But the words didn't hold any power anymore. By the third night, sleep wouldn't come. The snow had thickened, the air outside sharp as glass. He stood by the window, looking out across the dark hills. In his mind, he saw that small girl walking alone through the cold, her mother sick and helpless. He remembered the way she'd looked up at him, not with fear, but with faith that he'd come, and faith, he realized, was a promise you couldn't just ignore at dawn. Eli saddled his horse and rode hard toward Hollow Creek. The wind bit at his face, snow stinging his skin, but he didn't slow. The world around him was a blur of white and gray, his heart pounding with something that felt like purpose, something he hadn't felt since the war, since before loss had turned him into stone. By the time he reached the edge of town, the storm had thickened into a whiteout. He could barely see the road, but he knew where he was going. Clara Dawson's cabin stood near the frozen creek, half hidden behind a cluster of bare trees. When he reached it, his stomach tightened. There was no smoke from the chimney. Dismounted and pushed through the snowdrift to the door. It was stuck, frozen at the hinges. One hard shove, and it swung open inside. The air was cold, too cold. A thin blanket lay crumpled on the floor beside the hearth, the fire long dead. Then he saw them. Clara lay on the bed, pale and still, her breathing faint but steady beside her. Little Annie sat wrapped in her mother's shawl, eyes red from crying but wide with relief when she saw him. "See, Mama," she whispered hoarsely. "I told you he'd come." Eli felt his throat tighten as he crossed the room. He checked Clara's pulse, weak, but there she was, burning with fever. He lifted her gently, careful not to wake her, and looked at Annie. "Pack your things, sweetheart. You're both coming with me." Annie nodded, trusting him without hesitation. She scrambled to gather her doll and a small bundle of clothes. Eli carried Clara outside, wrapping her in his coat. The wind howled around them, but he mounted his horse and pulled both mother and daughter close, shielding them from the storm. The mare struggled through the snow, hooves sinking deep, but Eli urged her forward. The ride home was slow and brutal. The snow blinded him. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he never stopped. All he could think about was the faint rise and fall of Clara's chest against his arm, a fragile rhythm of life that he refused to let fade. Hours later, when they finally reached his cabin, Eli kicked open the door and carried Clara straight to his bed. He stoked the fire high, the room filling with warmth and light. Annie huddled close, whispering prayers under her breath. Eli didn't pray. He just worked, removing Clara's wet clothes, wrapping her in blankets, feeding her sips of warm broth. He moved with quiet determination, like a man who'd finally remembered what it meant to care. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside that cabin, something stronger than the storm began to take root. For the first time in years, Eli Turner wasn't just surviving, he was fighting for someone else's life, and deep down, though he wouldn't yet admit it, he knew he was fighting for his own as well. The storm outside raged for 3 days without pause. Snow buried the fences. The barn roof sagged under the weight, and the wind screamed across the open prairie like a wild, wounded beast. Inside Eli Turner's cabin, though, there was a different kind of storm, one of fear, hope, and fragile beginnings. Eli hadn't had company in years, and now his home was filled with the sounds of life again, the crackle of the fire, the soft breath of a sleeping woman, and the gentle hum of a child whispering prayers beside her. Clara Dawson lay in his bed, fevered but alive, her body weak from days without food or rest. Annie, small and determined, refused to leave her mother's side. She sat wrapped in a quilt Eli had pulled from storage, watching every move he made as if afraid he might vanish. To Eli worked like a man with purpose. He fetched water from the half-frozen creek, boiled broth from what little meat he had, and kept the fire burning through every hour of the night. His big hands, rough from years of ranch work, moved gently when tending to Clara, wiping her brow, checking her pulse, making sure she stayed warm. He'd forgotten what it felt like to care for someone, to feel that their breath mattered more than his own. The second morning, Clara began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then full of confusion. Where am I?" she whispered weakly. Eli, sitting beside the bed, looked up from the fire. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Storms pass and you'll be fine." Clara tried to sit up, But he stopped her with a steady hand. "Rest," he said. "You've been sick near a week." When she saw Annie asleep on the floor, curled near the hearth, tears filled her eyes. "You saved us," she said faintly. Eli looked away, uncomfortable with the words, "did what anyone would have done," he muttered, but Clara knew that wasn't true in a world that turned its back on the weak. This silent man had chosen to help, not out of duty, but from something deeper, something kind. As the storm waned, the rhythm of the cabin began to change. Eli cooked simple meals, bread, beans, and stew from what he had in storage, and Annie, ever eager, followed him around like a shadow. She asked endless questions. Why horses slept standing up, how to braid rope, what cowboys ate for breakfast. Eli, who hadn't spoken this much in years, found himself answering. Sometimes his answers came out rough and awkward, but Annie didn't seem to mind at night. When Clara was strong enough to sit by the fire, the three of them would share quiet meals. Annie would chatter about her dreams, her laughter filling the small cabin like music, and Clara would watch Eli from across the table. There was something different about him, the way he softened when Annie smiled, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long when their hands brushed one evening. As the snow melted into slush outside and the first hint of spring crept into the air, Clara thanked him again. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. "You could have left us." Eli stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Couldn't do that," he said simply. "Not after what your girl said." Clara's breath caught. "Annie?" He nodded slowly. "She asked me to marry you." His voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. "Didn't know what to say then, still don't." "I guess," Clara smiled through tears. "She's got a big heart." "She does," Eli agreed. "Bigger than mine." "That's for sure." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was gentle, full of something unspoken but understood. The firelight flickered between them, warm and forgiving, and in that small cabin on the frozen prairie, two broken lives began to knit themselves back together when the storm finally ended. The world outside sparkled under a clear blue sky. Eli stepped out with Annie to mend the corral fence, and Clara stood in the doorway watching them for the first time in years. She felt something she'd thought long lost, the quiet, steady pulse of belonging. And for Eli Turner, the man who had once vowed never to feel again, the warmth of that small family was beginning to heal a wound far deeper than the winter's cold. When spring finally came to the prairie, it arrived like a quiet miracle. The snow melted into the thirsty ground, the creeks began to sing again, and soft buds bloomed along the fence posts that had once been buried in white for the first time in years. Eli Turner's ranch wasn't silent. It was alive with laughter, work, and the steady rhythm of new beginnings. Clara stood on the porch one morning, her hands resting on the railing, watching as Eli and Annie worked in the corral. Annie, dressed in Eli's old hat and boots far too big for her feet, was proudly leading a young calf toward its mother while Eli walked beside her, pretending not to notice when she tripped over the rope. He laughed, really laughed, and the sound warmed Clara more than the sunlight on her face. It was strange. She thought how quickly life could change. Just months before, she had been starving, desperate, and alone. Now she had a home, not just a roof or four walls, but a place filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of baking bread. And more than that, she had found someone who saw her not as a burden, but as a person worth saving. Eli had changed. Too, the man who once spoke in single words and lived like a ghost had come back to life. He repaired the barn, mended fences, and began tending to the neglected fields with a renewed purpose. But more than his work, it was his heart that had begun to heal. Where once he had carried only the memory of loss, now he carried Clara and Annie in its place, a reminder that love, even when broken, could be reborn one evening. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold and rose, Eli found Clara sitting by the creek, She was humming softly, her dress brushing the new grass. Her eyes lost in the shimmer of the water. "You fixing to run off?" Eli asked quietly, half smiling as he stepped closer. Clara shook her head. "Smiling too? Not this time," she said. "I was just thinking. How much this place feels like home now." Eli sat beside her. "The silence between them easy and full ain't much," he said, glancing toward the ranch. "Just a patch of land and a few old fences." "It's more than that," she said gently. "It's peace, it's family, something I thought I'd never have again." Eli's jaw tightened a little, and then he reached into his pocket. His hand trembled as he pulled out a small, worn silver ring. "Ain't got much to offer," he said, "but I reckon I can try to make this a real home for you." "If you'll stay?" Clara's breath caught, her eyes filling with tears. "Eli." "I ain't a man of many words," he continued, looking straight ahead. "But I mean every one of 'em, you and that little girl. You brought me back to life. I'd be honored if you'd let me keep you both here, not as charity, but as family." For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to pause, the soft rush of the creek, the whisper of the wind through the grass, even the distant sound of Annie's laughter. Then Clara reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "I'd stay anywhere with you." Eli let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a long winter finally ends that night. As the stars spread across the prairie sky, Annie crawled between them, her small hands clasped in theirs. "Mama," she said sleepily, "are we going to stay here forever?" Clara smiled, brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead. "Forever sounds just right," she whispered outside. The ranch glowed under the moonlight, a place once haunted by silence, now alive with love. The promise of spring had not just brought new life to the land, but to the hearts that called it home. And for Eli Turner, the silent rancher who once believed his story had ended long ago, this was his true beginning, a life not of loneliness, but of grace, family, and the love born from mercy.